You're just finishing up your day, walking down a dirt road in this small English village, and suddenly you see this woman walking towards you like she's just dropped out of a completely different universe. So she has this black turban wrapped tightly around her head, this long, heavy, exotic gown, and her clothes are covered in dirt like she has been walking on foot for weeks. A crowd immediately starts to form. People are whispering, staring, and finally somebody steps up to ask, "Hello, who are you? Where are you from? Are you lost?" And guys, the woman looks right at them and answers back immediately. But nobody can understand a single thing coming out of her mouth. The language sounds completely foreign, like nothing anybody in England has ever heard before. She's making these intense hand gestures, pointing down the road, and everybody's just standing there, wondering what to do next. Now, today, if a random stranger showed up in your neighborhood wearing a turban and, speaking an unknown language, you'd probably just call the local authorities or medical services, right? But this was 1817. Villages back then did not have modern police stations or emergency hotlines. So when there was trouble or when someone unusual was wandering around, the standard procedure was to take them straight to the most prominent, wealthy figure in the entire area. And in this specific village of Almondsbury, that man was called Samuel Worrell. So Samuel lived in this massive, beautiful estate called Knole Park. We're talking endless grounds, a full staff of servants, and very high-end furniture. He was a magistrate, which basically means that he was the local judge and administrator for the region. So the villagers surround this strange woman and then they escort her up the steps of this giant mansion. You can just picture the scene. The staff is trying to figure out what is happening. The villagers are crowding around and Samuel is just sitting at his desk trying to analyze this woman like a difficult case. He's trying to determine if she's a criminal running from the law or if she's simply a lost traveler in need of medical help. But the unusual thing is, this woman is not acting frightened at all. She does not look intimidated by his huge mansion or the judge. And that is when Samuel's wife, Elizabeth, notices something very specific. She realizes that the woman is looking at all the expensive crystal, the paintings, and the chandeliers with almost zero surprise. A typical peasant girl from the local area would likely be overwhelmed in a house like that. But this woman is totally calm, acting as if she's completely used to grand environments. Elizabeth is watching her fascinated. And then she leans over to her husband like, "Samuel, look at her. I don't think she's a beggar. She has to be someone really important." So Elizabeth actually convinces Samuel to let this strange woman stay at their mansion as a guest while they try to figure out who she is. A few days later, they decide to take her into the city of Bristol to see how she reacts to a bigger town. So they are walking down the street and then suddenly the woman stops dead in her tracks. She points at this picture of a fruit painted on a wall. Her eyes go wide and she starts shouting, "Ananas! Ananas!" Now, the English people around her are confused, but Samuel and Elizabeth, they freeze. And you know why? Because back then, English people were pretty much the only ones using the word pineapple. In French, Spanish, and Portuguese, the word for it is literally ananas. So Samuel looks at his wife like, "Oh my God, she knows the international word for the fruit." This is a major clue that she's a world traveler. So once they get her back to the mansion, her behavior just starts getting a whole lot more unusual. She's in her luxury room and then the servants knock, they come in and then they start bringing up all these kinds of different delicious dishes for her. We're talking about the absolute best kinds of food you could possibly eat in those times, like a premium hot roast beef. The kind of meal where if you're served it at a dinner party back then, every single guest would be completely thrilled to be there. The servants set it down, but she just looks at the food, declines it, and pushes it to the side. And then when the servants come back into the room later to collect the plates, they look down and realize that she has not touched a single bite. And guys, this doesn't just happen once. It happens so many times in a row that the kitchen staff finally realize that they need to stop serving her these expensive meals because the only things she will actually eat are raw vegetables. But that's not even the most surprising thing she did. The behavior that puzzled the entire staff always happened very early in the morning. Like, you seriously need to hear this one. The servants would wake up at sunrise to start their daily chores. They would look out the window and they would see this woman climbing all the way up onto the roof of the giant mansion. She would stand right on the edge of the roof. She would raise her arms all the way up to the sky. And then she would start loudly chanting, "Talu, talu, talu, talu," while bowing down to the sun. And you guys, it did not even stop there. The servants would go into her bedroom later to make the bed, and they realized that she didn't even sleep in it. She declined to use their high-end mattresses, and she would only sleep flat on the hard floor. She even shocked the staff by sneaking down to the private lake on the estate and swimming completely naked when she thought that no one was watching. She even made her own bow and arrows, and she would go out into the mansion's gardens to shoot targets. This whole thing actually just took me back to this girl I follow on Instagram who teaches these mini etiquette classes. You know, she does these videos where she shows you how to sit or eat in public. She'll be like, "Oh, don't hold your teacup this way, hold it this way, do this and do that." And sometimes I'm just sitting down there watching her like, oh my God, maybe I've been doing everything completely wrong my whole life. I mean, my head can barely contain all these rules. But learning about this story actually made me think back to those classes, and I realized that all these fancy etiquette rules were probably just started by some wealthy person centuries ago who was just hanging out in their room completely bored and decided to make up a funny little rule that everybody else just started following along with. Because this is exactly what happened in this mansion. Once Samuel and Elizabeth decided that this woman was a royal princess, they did not think that she was acting wild at all. They actually assumed that her unique roof rituals, sleeping on the floor, nude lake swimming, shooting arrows, and raw food habits were just part of her foreign culture. And get this, the family and their wealthy guests actually started copying her. Yeah, you heard that right. They started copying her. They found it fascinating, so they started imitating her unique language and gestures as a sign of cultural appreciation. It just shows you how quickly people can start treating unusual behavior differently once they believe that it is connected to a high status background. Everyone in the area was completely fascinated and trying to get an introduction to this woman. To get a definite answer on who she was, they invited top scholars to examine her, including a famous local intellectual named Dr. Wilkinson. So he became so thoroughly convinced by her that he actually wrote a formal letter to Bath Chronicle newspapers to publicly defend her authenticity. I actually found the exact real archive of what this highly educated doctor wrote to the public in May 1817. He literally stated, and I quote, "Her languages have a striking resemblance to the dialects of the East Indies. Her graphic characters resemble the Chinese." He went on to tell the newspapers that her posture and her manners proved that she was from a royal lineage. When a renowned doctor writes that in the national newspapers, the story gains massive credibility. But everything completely changed when this man named Manuel arrived at the house. He was a Portuguese sailor who heard about the mystery, and he told the family, "Look, I've traveled all over the ocean. I understand a lot of foreign languages. Let me talk to her." So they put Manuel in a room alone with this strange woman, and everybody's just waiting outside the door in total suspense. A little while later, the door opens up and Manuel walks out looking absolutely stunned. He looks at Samuel and Elizabeth and says, "I understand her perfectly." The story this sailor tells them is insane. He looks at the family and says, "Her name is Princess Caraboo, and she comes from this faraway island in the Indian Ocean called Javasu." He tells them this dramatic narrative about how she was just walking around her royal gardens on her island when suddenly these pirates jumped out, kidnapped her, and threw her onto a ship. He said she was held prisoner on this crowded ship for months until they finally got to the English coast. She realized this was her only chance to escape, so she secretly slipped away, jumped directly into the freezing ocean, and swam all the way to the shore. Now, when we hear a story like that today, we'll immediately be skeptical. But you have to remember that this is the early 1800s. Regular people did not have internet or television. In fact, most people back then lived and died within a few miles where they were born. They had never left their small towns, they had never traveled to another country, and the vast majority of them had never seen a single foreigner in their entire lives. To them, a foreign island did not just sound distant, it actually sounded like a completely different universe. Because of this, Elizabeth Worrell was swept up in the drama. She stops looking at this woman like a random village mystery, and then she starts treating her like an official royal guest. She goes out and purchases fine silks and expensive muslin cloth. And Caraboo takes these fabrics and starts sewing these beautiful, elaborate gowns and turbans for herself. At this point, word gets out and she becomes a massive national sensation. Scholars, famous doctors, and top intellectuals, they start traveling from all over the country to Knole Park just to analyze her. They show up with giant world maps and heavy books written in Greek, Arabic, and Chinese, trying to see if she can recognize them. But Caraboo remains completely calm. She looks at their books and handles the situation very smoothly. She takes their ink pens, she sits down, and then she starts drawing these unique symbols on paper, presenting them as her native alphabet. And guys, these drawings were actually saved, so we can still see them today. She literally sat there and drew these symbols to show them how people on her island write words for the sun, the earth, and the god that she prayed to, whom she called Allah Ta'ala. She was basically building a whole language and a whole religion from scratch on a piece of paper, right in front of their faces. And the experts found it highly convincing. High society became completely obsessed with the story. I mean, Elizabeth starts taking her to the city of Bath, which at the time was the premier location where prominent families went to socialize. And then Caraboo instantly becomes a major celebrity. Everybody wants a piece of Caraboo. Everybody wants an invitation to see the Princess of Javasu. But the bigger the story got, the more public attention it attracted. Samuel and Elizabeth were so proud of their guest that they decided to hire a professional artist named John Eagle to paint a giant official portrait of her, wearing her fine silks and her iconic black turban. They take the print of this portrait and they put it on the front pages of the newspapers so that everybody in England can see her face, completely unaware that this national publicity is the exact thing that is about to change everything. Far away in a completely different town, a woman named Mrs. Knole is sitting down reading her morning newspaper. And then suddenly she freezes. She looks down at the picture of the Princess of Javasu and her jaw drops. Now, to understand why her jaw dropped, you have to know who Mrs. Knole actually was. She ran this local boarding house which back in the 1800s was basically the original old school version of couch surfing or a modern backpackers hostel. Have any of you ever actually tried to use couch surfing? Because I almost did it one time. I remember I was traveling and I looked into it, but then at the very last minute I changed my mind and decided to just stay in a hotel that was, closer to where I was going anyway. But yeah, sometimes I see people posting about it online and it's like this huge debate. Some people are talking about how they had really, really good experiences, but then other people are like, oh my god, don't ever try using couch surfing. So I really don't know. But if you think about that classic couch surfing vibe, where travelers who are on a budget and can't afford fancy hotels will go crash on a random spare bed or, share a tight room with bunk beds just to have a cheap place to sleep. That was exactly Mrs. Knole's house. It was a place for budget travelers. And Mrs. Knole is staring at this national newspaper, looking at this glamorous princess in fine silks. And she doesn't see foreign royalty at all. She instantly recognizes the face of a regular English girl named Mary Baker, who had literally been staying at her boarding house just a few months earlier. And Mrs. Knole remembered that While Mary was staying there, she used to pass the time by wrapping random cloths around her head and practicing these unusual made-up languages just for entertainment. So Mrs. Neal doesn't waste a single second. She gets up, grabs the newspaper, and goes straight to the Worrell family mansion. Like, tell me that you would not want to be a fly on the wall at that exact moment when Mrs. Neal barges right into the mansion and confronts her. You have to lean into the second-hand embarrassment here, you guys. 1 minute, you're hosting a grand gathering, pouring expensive tea for a royal guest. And then the next minute, a woman from a local boarding house walks right through your front door, points a finger and says, this is not a princess. That is just Mary from Devon. The tension in that room must have been completely suffocating. And when Mary looked up and saw Mrs. Neal standing there, she knew the situation had reached its end. The foreign language instantly disappeared, and she spoke perfect English for the first time. And do you remember that Portuguese sailor Manuel, who claimed he could translate her? Well, this is where his entire situation comes out. It turns out that Manuel and Mary did not even know each other. This was not a pre-planned partnership at all. So Manuel was just a completely random sailor who heard rumors about a mysterious woman staying at a wealthy estate. And so he walked into that mansion, saw this woman talking in a unique language, and realized that if he just pretended to be a brilliant world traveler who could translate her, he could secure a place to stay and access to a very comfortable lifestyle. It worked perfectly for a short time, giving him a room and high society attention. But the exact second Mrs. Neal exposed the truth, Manuel panicked, realizing his time at the mansion was over, and before the magistrate could start asking serious questions, he packed his bags in the middle of the night and completely disappeared, leaving Mary to face the entire situation by herself. Now you can only imagine the absolute panic that hit the mansion the second the truth came out. To avoid a massive public trial that would embarrass all those famous doctors, judges and scholars who got fooled, the Worrell family decided that they had to handle everything quietly. So they basically needed to manage the situation before the press made them a subject of public ridicule across the region. So they quickly purchased Mary a ticket and placed her onto a ship heading straight to America, just to remove her from the local media spotlight. But even on the ship, you guys, across the ocean, Mary continued her behavior. She started a brand new rumor among the passengers, claiming that her ship had stopped at a secret island where Napoleon Bonaparte was locked up, and she told everybody that Napoleon had fallen in love with her and begged her to marry him. It seems she had a deep, consistent need to present herself as someone extraordinary. But when she finally arrived in Philadelphia, she discovered that the news had actually traveled across the ocean faster than her boat, and the American public already knew her story. An American showman named Sanders convinced her to capitalize on this public curiosity, and he put her on a theater stage at Washington Hall. But the performance was highly unusual. Mary would walk out on stage wearing her silks and turban, beat a giant gong, perform dramatic dances, and speak in her made-up language. However, the American crowds were not receptive. You see, back in the English mansion, the scenario worked because the hosts truly believed that she was a genuine princess. But the theater audience already knew the facts. They knew that she was an exposed fraud. Instead of viewing it as an exotic cultural experience, it felt like watching somebody recycle an old story just for ticket money. The show was a failure, obviously, and Mary eventually wrote a letter back to England complaining about the difficulties of public life. After a few years in America, she realized that public interest had faded, and in 1824, she quietly returned to England, completely broke. She went right back to the Bristol area and the exact same region where the original deception took place. She eventually got married, had a daughter, and took a job to make a living. And you guys, her occupation was incredibly stark compared to her past. So in the mid-1800s, medical practices often relied on bloodletting, believing that draining a patient's blood could cure illnesses. So the most common way that they did this was by using live leeches, Clinics needed thousands of them, so Mary Baker's job was selling live leeches to the local Bristol hospital. To harvest them, Mary would literally have to walk directly into muddy, freezing swamps and use her own legs as baits. She would stand in the water, waiting for the leeches to latch onto her skin, then walk out of the mud, remove them, and place them in a bucket to sell them. It's a massive contrast to her time at the mansion, moving from fine silks and high society attention to harvesting leeches in a swamp just to pay rent. She eventually passed away in 1864 at the age of 75, and she was buried in an unmarked grave. But when we look back at this entire story, it leaves us with some really fascinating questions about the psychology behind this whole case. On one hand, Mary Baker's actions were a clear, calculated deception that disrupted an entire community and manipulated the trust of a family that took her in. But on the other hand, historians and psychologists often look at this case to understand how a regular maid managed to read social dynamics so accurately. When she later explained how she did it, she admitted that she had simply combined real foreign words she picked up while working as a servant, like a few Romani, French, and Arabic words, and mixed them with her own sounds. She also noted how easily people can convince themselves of something simply because they don't want to admit that they don't know the answer. In the end, Mary was never put on trial, largely because a public court case would have brought a massive amount of unwanted attention to the local officials and scholars involved. Instead, the family just chose to quietly send her away. But as we saw with the rumors on the ship, the desire to create these elaborate identities seemed to follow Mary for the rest of her life. So what do you think actually drove Mary Baker to pull off one of the strangest deceptions in history? Was she just a calculated con artist looking for a comfortable life, or was there a deeper psychological need to completely escape her reality? Let me know what your theories are down in the comments, and I will see you in the next story.